Sometimes the people who call you family don't stop loving you overnight. They simply stop seeing you. I spent 32 years trying to earn a place at my own family's table. Then one ordinary afternoon, a single sentence changed my life forever. My name is Natalie Brooks, and until that day, I believed love was something you earned by being useful. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon, and I had been standing in my mother's kitchen for hours. The countertops were covered with bowls, flour and frosting. My feet hurt, but I didn't care. I was making my younger brother's birthday cake, and I wanted it perfect because making my family happy always made me feel like I belonged. Just as I finished writing his name across the top, my mother walked into the kitchen. She looked at the cake for a moment, and I smiled, hoping she would finally say she was proud. Instead, she turned toward my brother and said, "Tell everyone Vanessa made it. It'll sound more impressive." I didn't say a word. Vanessa wasn't me. She was my sister-in-law. She had been part of our family for only 3 years, yet somehow she received the appreciation I had spent my entire life chasing. Everyone gathered around the cake, complimenting her talent while I stood only a few feet away, unseen. That wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It was simply the first time I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. For most of my life, I was the dependable daughter. I remembered birthdays, paid forgotten bills, drove my parents wherever they needed to go, and quietly solved problems nobody else wanted to deal with. Whenever something went wrong, they called me. Whenever everything worked out, someone else received the praise. 3 weeks before my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, they announced they wanted the biggest celebration our family had ever hosted. Everyone smiled with excitement. Then, exactly as always, every eye slowly turned toward me. Natalie will organize everything. Every conversation stopped as soon as my mother said those words. No one questioned it. No one looked at me to see whether I agreed. It was simply decided, the same way everything had always been. My aunt smiled and said, "Natalie has always been good at these things." My uncle laughed. "We'll finally have a celebration people will remember." My younger brother, Mason, leaned back in his chair with a relieved smile, as though another responsibility had quietly disappeared from his shoulders. Even Vanessa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're amazing at planning events," she said warmly. "I don't know how you do it." I smiled politely because I had become an expert at pretending everything was fine. The truth was, nobody realized that every compliment they gave me usually came attached to another obligation. They admired my reliability, but they never wondered what it was costing me. The following morning, I opened my laptop before leaving for work and started researching venues. My lunch break disappeared into phone calls with caterers. That evening, I visited 2 country clubs before driving across town to meet a florist. By the time I arrived home, it was almost 10 o'clock. I kicked off my shoes, dropped onto the couch, and stared at the growing list of deposits, invoices and contracts. The numbers climbed higher with every decision. Better flowers. Better music. Better food. Every suggestion my family made came with another expense, and somehow every bill found its way back to me. Over the next week, my apartment slowly transformed into a temporary event office. Fabric samples covered the dining table. Seating charts filled the walls. My phone rang constantly with vendors asking for approvals. Yet despite everything I was doing, not one family member ever asked a simple question. "Natalie, do you need any help?" Instead, new requests kept arriving. And just when I thought the planning couldn't become any more overwhelming, my mother called with one demand that changed everything. My mother's name flashed across my phone just as I finished another meeting with the caterer. I answered with a smile, expecting another question about flowers or table decorations. Instead, she got straight to the point. "Natalie, your father and I have been thinking. Since this is our 40th anniversary, we want everything to feel luxurious. The country club is nice, but I don't think it's elegant enough anymore." I closed my eyes for a second. "Mom, we've already signed the contract." She sighed as if I were the one creating the problem. "I know, sweetheart, but people will remember this day forever. We found another venue. It's much more beautiful." A few seconds later, a link appeared on my phone. I opened it and felt my stomach tighten. The new venue cost almost twice as much as the first one. Before I could say anything, my mother continued, "You'll figure it out. You always do. After hanging up, I sat silently in my car staring at the screen. Canceling the original booking meant losing the entire deposit. Booking the new venue meant spending thousands more. Neither option made sense, but deep inside, I already knew what would happen. I would find a way because that's what I had always done. That evening, I called the country club and canceled the reservation. The manager sounded genuinely surprised. Are you sure? You'll lose every dollar you've already paid. I swallowed hard before answering. Yes, I understand. The call ended, and with it disappeared nearly $5,000 I had worked months to save. When I arrived at my parents' house later that night to discuss the changes, everyone was sitting around the dining table laughing. My mother proudly showed everyone pictures of the new venue, while relatives admired the crystal chandeliers and grand ballroom. My father smiled at me. Your mother says you handled everything already. I knew we could count on you. Not one person asked how much the change had cost. Not one person offered to help cover the difference. They simply assumed I would somehow make it happen. Then Vanessa smiled across the table and innocently asked the question that made the entire room suddenly go quiet. Natalie, you're paying for all of this yourself, aren't you? Vanessa's question hung in the air like no one knew how to answer it. Every conversation stopped. My mother looked at her with a puzzled expression, while my father slowly turned toward me. I forced a small smile and shrugged. It's only temporary. I'll manage. Before anyone could respond, my mother laughed softly. See, that's exactly why Natalie is so dependable. She never complains. Everyone nodded in agreement, and just like that, the moment disappeared. No one asked whether I should be paying. No one reached for a checkbook. No one even suggested sharing the cost. Instead, they continued discussing flower arrangements and dinner menus, as though spending tens of thousands of dollars was the most ordinary thing in the world. I quietly lowered my eyes and took another sip of coffee, pretending the tight feeling in my chest didn't exist. The following week became a blur of endless appointments. Every morning I worked a full day at the financial firm, and every evening I rushed across the city meeting photographers, musicians, decorators, and event coordinators. My apartment no longer felt like home. It looked more like a storage room filled with invitation samples, contracts, receipts, and color palettes. Some nights I fell asleep on the couch with my laptop still open beside me. Every time I crossed another task off my list, two more appeared. Yet whenever my phone rang, I answered with the same cheerful voice because I didn't want anyone to think I couldn't handle it. 2 days later, I stopped by my parents' house to deliver the printed invitations. As I walked toward the living room, I heard my mother talking to a neighbor through the open window. We're so lucky to have Mason, she said proudly. He's making this anniversary possible. We could never afford something this beautiful without him. I froze. The invitations nearly slipped from my hands. Mason didn't correct her. He simply smiled, accepted the compliment, and thanked the neighbor. Standing quietly in the hallway, I realized something that hurt even more than being ignored. They weren't forgetting what I had done. They were giving my sacrifices to someone else on purpose. I stood in that hallway for several seconds, listening as my mother continued praising Mason for work he had never done. Every compliment landed like another quiet reminder that, in this family, the truth only mattered when it made someone else look good. I wanted to walk into the room and correct her. I wanted to tell everyone that I had paid every deposit, signed every contract, and spent every evening making this celebration possible. But I already knew what would happen. My mother would call me sensitive. My father would say it wasn't the right time. Mason would promise to clear up the misunderstanding later, and nothing would change. So I straightened the stack of invitations in my hands, forced another smile onto my face, and walked into the living room as if I hadn't heard a single word. The final week before the anniversary passed faster than I expected. Every detail slowly came together. The ballroom looked beautiful. The flowers arrived exactly on schedule. The band rehearsed the songs my parents loved, and the custom photo wall displayed memories from 40 years of marriage. Guests would never know how many sleepless nights had gone into creating that evening. They would only see the finished result, and somehow I already knew someone else would receive the credit. The night before the celebration, I sat alone in my apartment reviewing the final payment receipts. My savings account looked almost empty. The small house I had dreamed of buying one day suddenly felt farther away than ever. I stared at the screen for a long time before quietly closing my laptop. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What if my family never changes? The thought scared me more than losing the money. Because if the answer was yes, then maybe the only person who needed to change was me. The next morning, I tried pushing those thoughts aside. There was still too much to finish, and the anniversary was less than 24 hours away. I spent the day confirming guest arrivals, checking the seating chart one last time, and making sure every vendor had received their final schedule. By sunset, the ballroom looked exactly the way my parents had imagined it. Soft candlelight reflected from crystal chandeliers, fresh white roses lined every table, and a live string quartet quietly rehearsed near the stage. Watching everything finally come together should have made me feel proud. Instead, I felt strangely empty, as though I had built a beautiful memory that didn't belong to me. Guests began arriving the following evening dressed in elegant suits and evening gowns. The ballroom quickly filled with laughter, music, and conversations. Everywhere I looked, people were complimenting the decorations and admiring the atmosphere. "This place is incredible," one guest said. "Whoever planned this deserves an award." I smiled politely as I welcomed everyone through the entrance, but before I could answer, my mother stepped beside me with a proud smile. "Mason and Vanessa worked so hard on everything," she said. "They wanted this night to be perfect for us." Several guests immediately turned toward my brother and applauded. Mason looked surprised for only a second before accepting every compliment with an appreciative smile. Vanessa glanced at me from across the room. For the first time, she looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. Our eyes met briefly, but she said nothing. She simply looked away, while everyone continued congratulating the wrong people. I quietly stepped outside onto the balcony, taking a deep breath as cool evening air filled my lungs. Looking through the glass windows, I watched my family celebrating inside without realizing the person who had sacrificed the most was standing alone in the dark. Then my phone vibrated. One unexpected message appeared on the screen. And after reading it, I realized someone had finally discovered the truth. I stared at the message for several seconds before opening it. It came from Vanessa. There were only 9 words on the screen. "Can we talk? Please don't tell anyone I contacted you." My heartbeat quickened. I looked through the ballroom window and saw her smiling beside Mason as guests continued taking photographs. If someone had looked closely, they would have noticed her smile never reached her eyes. I typed a short reply. "I'm outside." Less than a minute later, she quietly slipped onto the balcony, closing the glass door behind her. The music instantly became distant. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Vanessa took a deep breath. "Natalie, I need to tell you something." She looked genuinely nervous. "I didn't know you were paying for this anniversary." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She lowered her eyes. "Your mother told everyone Mason was covering all the expenses. Even he believed most of the money was coming from your parents' savings." I felt my stomach tighten. "So nobody knew?" She slowly shook her head. "Not until yesterday." She reached into her purse and handed me a folded envelope. Inside were copies of bank transfer confirmations with my name printed on every payment. "I found these while helping your mother organize some paperwork," she whispered. When I asked her about them, she told me to forget I had ever seen them. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. It wasn't just that my family had ignored my sacrifices. They had deliberately hidden them. They had created a completely different story. One where Mason became the devoted son while I quietly disappeared into the background. Vanessa's eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Natalie. If I had known the truth sooner, I never would have accepted their praise." Before I could answer, applause suddenly erupted inside the ballroom. My father had just stepped onto the stage, and judging by the microphone in his hand, he was about to thank the one person who deserved it the least. My father adjusted the microphone and smiled as the room slowly grew quiet. Nearly 80 guests turned toward the stage, waiting to hear his speech. I remained outside on the balcony, watching through the glass doors while Vanessa stood silently beside me. My father cleared his throat before speaking. 40 years ago, I married the love of my life. Everything we've built since then has only been possible because our family has always stood together." The audience applauded warmly. My mother reached for his hand, smiling proudly. Then he looked toward Mason. "And this celebration," he continued, "would never have happened without my son. Mason, you've sacrificed so much for us. Your generosity, your love, and your commitment to this family have given your mother and me a night we'll never forget." The room erupted into applause. Guests stood from their seats, clapping as Mason walked onto the stage. My brother looked surprised, but only for a moment. Then he smiled, accepted the applause, and hugged our parents while cameras flashed from every corner of the ballroom. I felt no anger anymore. Only exhaustion. Years of trying to earn appreciation suddenly seemed meaningless. Vanessa looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Natalie, you don't deserve this." I gave her a small, tired smile. "No. Quietly. I don't." For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering how to fix the situation. I wasn't searching for another sacrifice that might change their minds. Deep inside, something had finally become clear. Some people don't fail to appreciate you because they forget. They fail because acknowledging your value would force them to change the story they've been telling themselves for years. Just then, the master of ceremonies stepped back onto the stage. "Before we continue," he announced, "we've prepared a short slideshow featuring everyone who helped make tonight possible." The lights dimmed. A large screen slowly lowered from the ceiling. I expected another tribute to Mason. Instead, the very first photograph that appeared made the entire ballroom fall silent. The ballroom fell completely silent as the first photograph appeared on the giant screen. It wasn't a family portrait. It wasn't a picture of Mason shaking hands with vendors or choosing decorations. It was a security camera image from the country club taken 3 weeks earlier. There I was, standing alone in the empty ballroom before sunrise, checking table layouts with a clipboard in one hand and my laptop in the other. The next photograph showed me meeting the florist. Then another appeared, showing me signing contracts with the caterer. Another captured me unloading boxes of decorations from my own car. One after another, dozens of photographs filled the screen, each one stamped with a different date and time. Every image told the same story. I had been there from the beginning, quietly building every detail, while everyone else believed someone else deserved the credit. Confused whispers spread across the room. Guests looked from the screen to Mason, then toward my parents. My father frowned, clearly seeing these photographs for the first time. My mother suddenly looked nervous. The master of ceremonies stared at the control booth. "I'm sorry," he said into the microphone. "This isn't the slideshow we rehearsed." The technician immediately began pressing buttons, trying to stop the presentation, but it continued on its own. Another image appeared. This time it was a scanned receipt showing my name beside the first venue deposit. Then came another invoice. And another. Every payment carried the same signature. I slowly walked back inside the ballroom. No one noticed me at first because every eye remained fixed on the screen. Vanessa quietly stepped beside me without saying a word. Across the room, Mason's confident smile had completely disappeared. He looked at my mother with a confused expression, silently asking a question she couldn't answer. For the first time all evening, the story my family had created was beginning to fall apart. Then the final slide appeared. Across the center of the screen in large black letters were the words, "The person you thanked didn't pay for this celebration." And beneath that sentence, my name appeared. A heavy silence settled over the ballroom. No music. No applause. Just dozens of shocked faces staring first at the screen, then at me. My father slowly lowered the microphone. "Natalie," he whispered, almost as if he didn't recognize the name he had just read. My mother immediately stood up. "There has to be some mistake," she said nervously. "Those slides weren't supposed to." Her voice faded as another receipt appeared behind her, followed by a signed contract and several bank confirmations. Every document carried my signature. Every payment came from my account. There was no misunderstanding anymore. There was only the truth. Guests began whispering among themselves. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked directly at my parents, waiting for an explanation. Mason stepped away from the stage and walked toward me. "Natalie," he said quietly, "I swear I didn't know." I looked into his eyes for a long moment. For the first time that evening, I believed him. He hadn't created the lie. He had simply lived inside it. Before I could answer, Vanessa spoke. "She's telling the truth," she said firmly. "I found every payment yesterday. Your mother asked me not to mention any of it." The room became even quieter. My father slowly turned toward my mother. "Is that true?" he asked. She looked around the ballroom, avoiding everyone's eyes. "I only wanted tonight to be special," she whispered. "People expect the son to do these things. I didn't think it mattered who actually paid." My father's face changed completely. 40 years of calm dignity disappeared in a single moment. "It mattered," he replied quietly. "Because you didn't just hide the truth. You erased our daughter." I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. Months earlier, I would have desperately wanted this recognition. Now standing there in complete silence, I realized something unexpected. Their apology could never return everything I had already lost. And at that moment, I made a decision that nobody in the room saw coming. I took one slow breath before walking toward the stage. Every step echoed through the silent ballroom. People moved aside without saying a word. Just an hour earlier, I would have done anything to hear my parents acknowledge me in front of everyone. Now, standing beneath the bright lights, I realized I didn't need their applause anymore. I reached for the microphone, but before speaking, I looked at my father. His eyes were filled with regret. My mother couldn't even look at me. Mason stood beside Vanessa, still trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. "I appreciate everyone being here tonight," I began calmly. "But this evening was never about proving who paid the bills." I paused, letting the silence settle. It was about celebrating 40 years of marriage. I wanted my parents to have one beautiful memory together. That's why I never asked for recognition. Several guests slowly nodded. "The problem isn't that nobody thanked me," I continued. "The problem is that the truth had to be hidden so someone else could look more important." My words weren't angry. They were honest. Somehow, that made them hurt even more. I turned toward Mason. "I don't blame you," I said. "You accepted the story you were given." Tears filled his eyes as he quietly whispered, "I'm sorry, Natalie." Then I looked at my mother. "What hurts isn't the money. I'll earn that back. What hurts is spending my entire life believing that if I loved this family enough, one day I'd finally be enough." My mother covered her face as tears began falling. Guests looked away, giving her a privacy she hadn't given me. I gently placed the microphone back onto its stand. "The anniversary should continue," I said softly. "Everyone deserves a beautiful evening." I picked up my handbag and walked toward the ballroom entrance. Behind me, I heard my father call my name. But this time, for the first time in my life, I kept walking. The ballroom doors closed quietly behind me as I stepped into the cool night air. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing to solve another family problem. My phone vibrated almost immediately. First my father called, then Mason, then my mother. I looked at the screen for a few seconds before placing the phone back into my purse. Tonight wasn't the night for another conversation. Some wounds needed silence before they could ever begin to heal. I drove home with the windows down, letting the cold breeze clear my thoughts. When I walked into my apartment, the silence felt unfamiliar. There were still invitation samples stacked on the dining table, leftover contracts beside my laptop, and a notebook filled with months of planning. Only a few hours earlier, those papers had reminded me of everything I had sacrificed. Now they simply reminded me of someone I was no longer willing to be. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of unread messages. Friends, relatives, and even guests from the anniversary had somehow found my number. Many apologized for never knowing the truth. Others thanked me for everything I had done. I appreciated every message, but none of them changed what had happened. Recognition after humiliation wasn't the same as appreciation given with honesty. Around noon, someone knocked on my apartment door. When I opened it, my father was standing there alone. He looked older than he had the night before. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes were red from a sleepless night. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he held out a small envelope with trembling hands. "I should have given this to you years ago," he said quietly. I looked down at the envelope but didn't reach for it. Because somehow, I already knew that whatever was inside couldn't erase the past, but it might finally explain it. For a few seconds, I simply looked at the envelope in my father's hands. It wasn't large. Just a plain cream envelope with my name written across the front in his handwriting. The same handwriting that had signed birthday cards, graduation letters, and every Christmas gift throughout my childhood. Slowly, I reached out and took it. Inside was a folded document and a single photograph. The picture showed me at 12 years old, sitting beside my father in his tiny construction office. I was smiling while helping him organize invoices after school. I remembered that day. He had told me I was his little partner. Looking at the photograph now, my chest tightened. I never stopped being proud of you, my father said quietly. I just stopped saying it. His voice cracked. And after a while, your silence became normal to us. We expected you to carry everything because you always did. He lowered his head. That wasn't strength, Natalie. That was our selfishness. I unfolded the document beneath the photograph. It was a handwritten letter. My father explained that years ago, when the company nearly went bankrupt, he had secretly promised himself he would repay every dollar I had sacrificed. But life became busy, excuses replaced action, and eventually everyone, including him, started believing the version of the story where Mason had rescued the business. The lie became easier than the truth, he admitted. And I failed the daughter who never once failed me. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't the same tears I had cried my entire life. These weren't tears of disappointment. They were the painful release that comes when someone finally admits the truth you've carried alone for years. My father reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small set of keys on the table between us. I sold the lake cabin last month, he said softly. This is the down payment for the house you've dreamed about. I stared at the keys, completely speechless. But before I could answer, someone knocked on my apartment door again. I looked toward the door, still holding the keys in one hand while my father's letter rested on the table beside me. Neither of us moved for a moment. The knock came again, softer this time. When I opened the door, Mason and Vanessa were standing in the hallway. Mason looked nothing like the confident man who had accepted applause at the anniversary. His shoulders were heavy, and his eyes were swollen from a sleepless night. Vanessa quietly stood beside him, giving him the courage to speak first. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, Mason said, because I know I don't deserve that yet. He swallowed hard before continuing. I spent years believing I had earned things that actually came from your sacrifices. I never questioned the story because it made me feel important. I should have. He reached into his pocket and placed a folded check on the table beside the house keys. This is the money I've saved over the last 5 years. It isn't everything you spent, but it's a start. I looked at the check without touching it. My father stood silently behind me, watching his son with the same disappointment he had carried since the anniversary. Mason wiped his eyes before speaking again. I don't want your money to define our relationship anymore. I just want the chance to become the brother you always believed I was. Vanessa stepped forward. I accepted praise that never belonged to me, she admitted. I can't change the past either, but I promise I'll never stay silent again when the truth matters. For the first time in years, my family wasn't making excuses. They weren't blaming circumstances. They weren't asking me to understand. They were finally accepting responsibility. I took a slow breath and gently pushed the check back toward Mason. I appreciate what you're trying to do, I said calmly. But healing doesn't begin with money. It begins with honesty. The room fell silent again, because deep down, everyone knew those words weren't just about the anniversary. They were about every year we had lost, and whether we still had the courage to rebuild what remained. For a long moment, nobody spoke. My apartment, which had witnessed so many lonely nights, now held something it had never held before. Honesty. My father looked at Mason. Mason looked at me. Vanessa quietly wiped away a tear. It wasn't a perfect family reunion. It wasn't the kind of ending people see in movies where one apology magically fixes everything. Some wounds are simply too deep for that. But for the first time, every person in the room had stopped pretending the past never happened. That was where real healing began. I picked up the photograph my father had brought and smiled faintly. Do you remember this day? I asked. He nodded. You spent hours helping me organize invoices, he replied. When we finished, you told me you wanted to build something people could be proud of. I looked down at the picture again. I still do, I said quietly. The difference is, now I know it doesn't have to come at the cost of my own happiness. My father slowly reached for my hand. Can you ever forgive us? He asked. I thought carefully before answering. Forgiveness isn't something you ask for once, I said. It's something you earn through the choices you make every day after today. He nodded, accepting my answer without arguing. For the first time in years, nobody expected me to carry the entire relationship alone. Over the following months, our family changed in small but meaningful ways. My parents insisted on sharing responsibilities instead of quietly handing them to me. Mason corrected anyone who tried to give him credit for sacrifices that belonged to someone else. Vanessa became one of my closest friends because she chose truth over comfort when it mattered most. As for me, I finally bought the little house I had dreamed about for years. Every room reminded me that my future no longer depended on earning someone else's approval. Looking back, I realized the anniversary hadn't stolen my savings. It had given me something far more valuable. The courage to stop confusing sacrifice with love. Because real love doesn't ask one person to carry everyone else forever. It stands beside them. And for the first time in my life, my family finally understood the difference. If this story touched your heart, remember this. The people who truly love you will never ask you to prove your worth by sacrificing yourself over and over again. Real love is built on honesty, respect, and appreciation, not silence. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next emotional journey. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were Natalie? Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care of yourself. And never forget your own value, even when others fail to see it. Red Heart.